We're coming on the air with breaking news tonight. Life sentences for the three men who murdered Ahmaud Arbery. And two of them, they're not going to get parole after an emotional day in the courtroom in Georgia, where the judge, in a bit of an unusual move, asked not for just a moment of silence, but a full minute of it. We'll explain why. We'll explain what comes next for those hate crime charges the three men still face. And in just a minute live, I'll bring in Arbery's father for more on how he's doing tonight. Plus, here in Washington, President Biden says he doesn't think COVID is here to stay, at least not in its current form. But there's a catch. We'll take a look at the pressure his administration faces as we're all waiting to hear how the Supreme Court will rule on his vaccine mandates. Spoiler, not looking good, at least for one of them. And with a month to go to the Winter Olympics in Beijing, we've got our reporter on the ground in China who has more on the nightmarish lockdowns there. Millions of people stuck in their homes begging for food. Plus, chances are good at least one of you watching is among the millions of Americans with student loan debt. We'll talk about the novel way some parents are picking up the tab for their kids in today's original. And the college swimmer who's setting records and getting flamed for it by some people. Why? Because she's transgender. How UPenn's Leah Thomas is now responding. Hey, I'm Hallie, and we know now how long Ahmaud Arbery's murderers will spend in prison in a case that catalyzed the national reckoning over race and justice in this country. Travis McMichael and his father, Gregory McMichael, will spend the rest of their lives in prison. No parole. The official sentence, life plus 20 years. That's almost the maximum they could have received. William Roddie Bryan will serve life, but he will have the opportunity for parole. Arbery, remember, was chased and shot while jogging down the street in February of 2020, nearly 2 years ago. And back in November, all three men were convicted of felony murder. And the judge today, in a powerful move, asked everyone in the court to sit in silence for 1 minute, he says, a fraction of the time Arbery was running from the three defendants. Outside the courtroom, Arbery's family came out to cheers, holding hands, raising their arms. You see him here. But the legal fight isn't over. Not all of them. All three killers say they'll appeal, and they'll still face federal hate crime charges next month. Katie Beck has been following this trial from Brunswick, Georgia. Danny Savalas is joining us as well. Katie, let me start with you, because even before this sentence was passed down and the judge kind of had that very remarkable moment where he called for silence, it was emotional in the courtroom, right? Talk about what you're hearing now from Ahmaud Arbery's family, knowing we're going to have his father on in just a minute.
Yeah, it was absolutely emotional throughout the day, Hallie. We were hearing these victim impact statements from Ahmaud's mother and father from the stand, talking about the heartbreak that will simply never go away, the Thanksgivings, the Christmases, the times that they had with their son that they won't have again. Lots of emotional moments leading up to the judge's decision. And then when the judge did give his decision, he opened a whole new window about how he really felt about this case. We really hadn't seen that from the judge before today. And he really put a spotlight on the fact that this was a tragedy. There was a young man with dreams who was taken out of this community and chased down. And he really put that exclamation point on it, as you say, with that moment of silence, that 1 minute, which was just one of the 5 minutes of terror that Ahmaud Arbery experienced during that chase. So there were a lot of emotional moments in the courtroom. Arbery's mother did come out and make this statement about sort of how victory was expected, and she's so glad she got it.
I sat in that courtroom for 5 weeks straight, but I knew that we would come out with a victory. Yes. I never doubted it.
And this is a woman that has been present for every action in this case, large and small. And now she says, tonight I will actually have sound sleep because I have done what I told my son when I buried him that I would do. I would get justice.
Yeah. Katie, what's it been like just outside the courtroom and inside it as you've been there for the sentencing? I remember, and viewers who watch the show will know, we talked about this back in November when the verdict came down. There were so many people that had gathered. There were protests, et cetera. What's it been like there today?
Yeah, those same faces, Hallie, that were here in weeks prior and during the trial were here today. And there was a great deal of celebration when the judge read those sentences. There seemed to be a sense of relief. There were some tears shed. There was no protesting today, but there was lots of hands being held and lots of support for Arbery's family.
Katie Beck, live for us there in Brunswick, Georgia. Katie, thank you. Danny Savalas, let me turn to you here because there's a couple of interesting legal aspects here. One of the things the judge did was really separate out Travis and Gregory McMichael from Roddie Bryan in the sentencing. He made a point to say he felt like it was a little different. Remember, Travis and Gregory McMichael, Travis McMichael had faced that malice murder charge. Roddie Bryan was the individual who was in the truck. Talk about your reaction to that moment? Did it surprise you to hear the judge make such a clear differentiation between these two?
No, it did not. Roddie Bryant did not have a firearm. He did not coordinate with the actual McMichaels. He never actually coordinated this chase, although he was involved in the chase, and he used his vehicle in a sense to block off Arbery, which is one of the felonies he was convicted of that led to felony murder. So, yes, there was a difference between what Bryant did and what the McMichaels did. And I wasn't surprised that the judge acknowledged that.
There's also, this isn't the end of the story, right? They'll have 30 days to appeal. They almost certainly will. And you've got all three men who face federal charges as well for hate crime charges, attempted kidnapping charges, too. Can you walk us through what happens next from here?
What happens next is in the next 30 days, each defendant will almost certainly file a notice of appeal. It's a short document, couple pages. And then in the months thereafter, they'll brief their appeal with more information for the appellate court about why they think their conviction should be overturned or whatever arguments they want to make. Meanwhile, the federal case is forthcoming. I, like many other litigants in federal court right now in criminal cases, are waiting to see how much delay the latest surge in COVID is going to bring. So who knows when that will happen? The timetables are all thrown off. But they face, and it's been called a hate crimes case, but it's more than that. I mean, they're charged with kidnapping. They're charged with using a firearm in the commission of a crime of violence. Those are essentially non-hate crimes. So it is a hate crimes prosecution, but it's more than that. Additional federal crimes and all with very serious penalties. There really isn't any such thing as non-serious crime in federal court. All of them carry stiff penalties.
Danny Zavalos, thank you very much for that. I want to bring in now the father of Ahmaud Arbery, somebody who was there today, has been there through so much of this, Marcus Arbery, and the Arbery family attorney, Ben Crump. I want to thank both of you for being here. Mr. Arbery, especially you. You and we talked after the conviction of your son's killers. And I wonder how you're doing tonight now that they've all been sentenced to life, two of them without the possibility of parole.
Oh, I feel great. Justice was served. I just give all glory to God and all my attorneys and stuff. It's a good day, but a bitter day. Ahmaud still ain't with us, but we got justice for him.
One of the things that the judge said, Judge Walmsley said today, he talked about accountability, which is something, again, that you and I have talked about. He said that closure may be best as an exercise in accountability. And he said today defendants are being held accountable for actions here, and it demonstrates everybody is accountable to rule of law. So I ask you, Mr. Arbery, do you feel like there's been accountability? And separately, do you feel like you have any measure of closure now?
Yes, I can kind of rest some, and Ahmaud can rest in peace now because, his family got justice for him. But he's still not with us.
Mr. Crump, how about you? I know that you've said today that the sentencing stems from these larger movements about justice and race. Can you tell me what you meant by that?
Certainly. It really was about a sustained movement of people who have historically been marginalized and disenfranchised. But when we came together, black, white, preachers, activists saying, Ahmaud Arbery, life matters, you can get accountability. And the thing I really thought about as I stood on the courthouse steps here in Glenn County, Georgia, I thought about all the black people in the history of America who have been lynched, all those lost souls who have been taken from this earth far too soon and never got their day in court, Hallie, never got anybody arrested, or much less convicted. I thought about them, and this day was for Wanda and Marcus, but it was also for the souls of black folks who are still burning who have never gotten justice.
On that issue of justice, Mr. Arbery, your son in many ways has become a symbol to a lot of people around the country, but he was also a person. He was a person you loved. He was your son. He was your kid. How do you want people to remember him?
As a loving boy, and he was the type of boy that he wanted all people to be together. So he was loved by who all knowed him. If you knowed him, you understand he was a kid of love.
We are coming up on 2 years almost since his murder. Can you talk me through how you've processed the last 2 years and where you are now compared to, let's say March of 2020, just a few weeks after your son was killed?
Oh, Lord, it was a struggle. You know, you wake up every day and you know your kid gone, and you know we still got a lot of work to do and still got a long way to go. You know, but we just want everybody to be treated fairly. So this world can come together and everybody just respect each other for what color they are and the race they is. That's all we want. I want everybody to come together and be equal. You know, and I just want people to just remember my boy as a young man that loved life and he just loved to work out and stuff like that. Then I just want them to just know that he just was just love, and his family loved him.
Yeah. Mr. Crump, to that point, you know, we've talked about systemic change and the way that this trial, you know, this verdict, this sentencing would not have even happened in all likelihood if it wasn't for the video that was taken, right? We know that the former prosecutor in this trial was recently indicted for obstruction and hindering a law enforcement officer, violation of oath, et cetera. Do you see the sentencing? Do you see that indictment, for example, as an indication that systemic change is on the way? Or are you more pessimistic than optimistic here?
I am optimistic because we have to believe that it will get better. When I really think about this matter, I think back to Trayvon Martin, who next month, February, will mark 10 years. And we will all be saying in America, 10 years after Trayvon Martin, how far have we come in our quest for racial justice in America? And I believe what happened here in Brunswick, Georgia today will send a profound proclamation that we're making progress on our journey to racial justice in America. The video was very important. I see very similar similarities in this killing of Ahmaud and Trayvon, but in Trayvon Martin, there was no video. Thank God there was a video in Ahmaud Arbery.
Benjamin Crump, Mr. Arbery, thank you both for being with us this afternoon. I know that it has been a long and difficult day and journey for the both of you. Thanks again. Back here in Washington.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Supreme Court seems kind of skeptical of one of President Biden's vaccine mandates that's leaving tens of millions of workers in limbo. We're talking about some cases so crucial to the court that the justices actually came back into session early to deal with them. The one they seem not so sure about involves vaccine testing requirements for big companies. The other, that reading the tea leaves, they may let stand, is about mandates for healthcare workers. The arguments could not be more timely. With this COVID Omicron surge that's happening now, hospitals are literally overflowing with patients. 26 states, more than half the country, in the last 24 hours have set records for cases. 27 set records for hospitalizations, as we're seeing more than 600,000 cases in this country. And by the way, as we talk about those Supreme Court arguments, COVID affected even them. Ohio's Solicitor General, who was making a case against the mandates, had to present his argument remotely because he has COVID. We got a lot to talk about tonight. Ken Delanian is with us on those vaccine mandates. Kristen Welker is posted up at the White House in response with what the Biden administration is doing for this whole thing. Ken, let me start with you here. Talk me through these arguments from court, because listen, I am no Supreme Court tea leaf reader, but the experts who are say it feels like they're pretty skeptical of this mandate for those big businesses. Why?
That's right. So just to review, the Supreme Court heard arguments on two separate Biden administration vaccine rules, Hallie. And after more than 3 hours of back and forth, it seemed clear that the court's conservative majority is poised to block the more sweeping of the two. As you said, that's the requirement by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration that every company employing more than 100 people has to require its workers to be vaccinated or test weekly those who refuse. And it wasn't so much the practical arguments that appeared to concern the conservative justices, Hallie, as the legal ones. They raised doubts about whether OSHA has the authority under a 50-year-old workplace safety law to impose this sweeping vaccine and testing requirement under emergency powers. Chief Justice John Roberts at one point suggested that perhaps Congress should do this and maybe individual states could do it, but not a single federal agency that regulates employers. Roberts and other conservatives argued that COVID is not just a workplace problem. Now, the three liberal justices pushed back hard on that idea. Justice Elena Kagan said that the workplace risk was really the biggest because, as she put it, you can decide for yourself whether to go to a baseball game, but not whether to come to work alongside people who may or may not be taking the right precautions. And I should add, Hallie, that on the other rule at issue today, that vaccine requirement for healthcare workers, that seemed to have a better chance of surviving because the Biden administration is making it a condition of receiving federal funds. So they have a better leg to stand on there. But at this point, it looks like a centerpiece of President Biden's COVID policy is at risk.
There's some urgency here, right? Because as we sort of alluded to in the introduction to you and Kristen, the justices weren't even set to come back to court until next week, but they're taking up these emergency appeals. There is some urgency to the timeline. Do you have any expectation? And I always hate to ask this question because I know we never know when the justices will rule. That's like a black box. But you have to think that'll come sooner rather than later, given all this.
Consulting our friend Pete Williams, I have some good information on this, that actually because this was heard on the emergency docket, and because this was urgent, because the OSHA mandate was about to take effect, that this could have come very soon. In fact, Justice Alito talked about perhaps an administrative stay, which means they just hold the thing in place while they further consider it. That could come within days if that happens. And if that doesn't happen, if they decide to rule on the merits, it's probably going to come within weeks as opposed to the usual months we have to wait for a Supreme Court ruling.
And not to mention some of these states now getting involved, including Virginia just today, saying, yeah, they're going to go after the Biden administration on this too. Ken Delaney, and thank you, Kendi. Appreciate it. Kristen, let me go to you. Okay, so you just heard what Ken had to say. The White House knows that analysis, right? What is your sense from the many sources that I know you talked to behind the scenes of how the White House is looking at what went down at the Supreme Court today?
Well, look, Hallie, this is obviously one of the critical tools that the administration believes it has in its toolbox to try to fight this virus. And so they are cautiously optimistic, at least on that second point, Hallie, that the court will rule in their favor. But there's no doubt that they are watching with anticipation, particularly when you talk about large businesses, because this has been an ongoing fight. And this has really been one of the ways in which the Biden administration feels as though it can try to get on the other side of this virus. But as you know, Hallie, this administration has been on defense on a range of different issues, not just those mandates, but obviously the communication and some confusion that is coming from the CDC and the new guidelines that it released just this week. Right. So the administration has really been on defense on a range of different issues here, Hallie.
I want to play a little something that the president said in response to our colleague, your co-chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander, when he asked, right, about whether COVID was here to stay, whether it is kind of the new normal. Here's the president on that.
No, I don't think COVID is here to stay. That having COVID in the environment here and in the world is probably here to stay. But COVID, as we're dealing with it now, is not here to stay. The new normal doesn't have to be. We have so many more tools we're developing.
So he's making the case this doesn't have to be the new normal. But, Chris, and I spoke to one of the former Biden health advisors from the transition team today who said, who's making the opposite case. You're saying they need some new tools and some new strategies here. I mean, you talk about it, right? You just said, Kristen, how the White House is facing some of this pressure, facing some of this criticism. It's just not going away when it comes to the pandemic response.
It is, and that's what those advisors were essentially saying, that the administration needs to face reality, that this is going to, in fact, be the new normal. And I think what you heard from President Biden there, which was an interesting response, he said it's not here to stay in its current form, which was sort of an acknowledgement to some extent that this is going to be a prolonged battle. And so when you think about what those tools are going to be to fight this moving forward, obviously the big one you have to think about is testing, Hallie, and that promise to get out 500 million tests in short order. And we learned today that the administration did award a contract to a company, $51 million to Gold Belt Securities, to try to get out some of those tests in short order, because that is a key component to fighting this virus. And then obviously vaccines as well. But look at the messaging coming from the administration this week, Hallie. You have them essentially trying to make sure that schools stay open, even though that is not happening everywhere, and trying to make sure that the economy continues to stay open in order to deal with this. So even though not acknowledging directly that COVID is here to stay, they are clearly trying to make plans and lay the groundwork for a very prolonged battle, Hallie.
Okay, Walker, before I let you go on a Friday night, let me just ask you, is there anything that's surprised you about the way that the president has responded or the White House has responded to this moment in the pandemic?
Well, look, I think that today was a notable moment, and it comes again. I go back to this point, Hallie, the backdrop of these guidelines coming out from the CDC, right, where they essentially announced last week they were shortening the quarantine time for people who test positive for COVID from 10 to 5 days. Then they said a couple days later, if you want to take a test, take a test. No one here is outright criticizing the CDC. Their messaging is that we are letting the science guide our decision-making process, and the CDC is leading that. But look at what happened today. The CDC held its first solo news conference, Hallie, in quite some time. And it's an acknowledgement, I think, that they need to turn the page when it comes to this messaging and get on the same page. Hallie.
Kristen Welker, TGIF, my friend, thank you. We'll look for more of your reporting tonight on Nightly. Thank you, my dear. The president's main point today, as you heard Kristen talk about, was to actually talk about the economy. He wasn't supposed to come out and make remarks on COVID. He did that in a Q&A. The whole thrust of the speech initially was about these economic numbers, which show a hint of good, a hint of bad, and a whole lot of uncertainty about where this country goes next. Here's your hint of bad, right? The jobs numbers, way missing the mark. 199,000 added, but economists have projected more than twice as many, right? Something like 400,000 plus. At the same time, here's your hint of good. This chart, the unemployment rate has ticked down to under 4%. It was at 6.3% last January. Now it's getting closer to pre-pandemic levels. So it is this number. You will be, I'm sure, not at all shocked to know that President Biden focused on the hint of good number and not the hint of bad number when he was making his argument. Watch.
I would argue the Biden economic plan is working and is getting America back to work, back on its feet.
But here's one thing that's not factored into these numbers at all. Omicron. That's because a lot of this data in December came before the surge really spiked and got really bad. Let me bring in Steve Leisman to break this down into regular human English for us. He's a senior economics reporter for CNBC. Steve, it's great to have you on. Thank you. Put this into context, right? Should we be feeling good or bad about the economy in just the plainest of terms?
You know, I hate to tell people how to feel, but if you have a job and you're getting a raise in this somewhat inflationary environment, you should feel pretty good.
Okay.
I think ultimately the job market is pretty tight. And I think that if I were to say which number better characterizes for me what's going on, I would say that low unemployment rate number does a better job.
Okay.
We've had some problems with that payroll number. The government has not done a good job during this pandemic of getting responses from companies about how many people they're employing. So they keep revising that number up as the months go by. Give you an example. The last 2 months, they revised up by a combined 140,000. That's a lot of jobs to have missed the first time around. Unemployment rate doesn't get revised. It's done by a survey of about 50,000 households. And I think that's telling the better number of a very tight labor market. Plus, you see the signs out there, you know, help wanted signs. You hear employers complaining about the wages they have to pay. It tells me we're in a pretty solid job market right now.
The wage thing is sort of interesting here, too. And you talked about, Steve, and I love it. Listen, if you're getting a raise in this inflation era time, like that's a pretty good thing. What does this mean? Because wages are up 0.5%, I think, better than last month, up nearly 5% since December. But then you do have, like, the inflation monster chopping away at that.
That's absolutely right. Well, it's 0.6% this month. It was pretty good, pretty strong. And the year over year is kind of keeping pace with inflation. It's running a little bit behind it. So overall, people's standard of livings on average are declining. But, you know, you have a lot of people quitting their jobs, and those people are quitting their jobs in general. They're leaving their jobs for better jobs, either better, you know, for their lifestyle or probably and hopefully better pay as well. And so in that context, those people are seeing probably better raises than inflation as they move into either different industries or better jobs. So right now, yes, the inflation is taking more than the average paycheck. But with this tight job market, I think some people are also doing better as well.
Really quick, though, because I think this is interesting. It's almost like a mirror image from last year. There's a full screen on a show. In 2020, right, last year, there were like 7 million job openings, 11 million people unemployed. Now it's the reverse. What areas, what sectors? You talked about people are taking jobs for a better lifestyle, you know, better mental health, you know, better ability to balance work and family at this time when everybody's working from home.
Yeah, well, I think people are they left the leisure and hospitality business. We know that for sure, and they're kind of reluctant to go back there, in part because the wages tend to be lower there, as well as in retail. And what you see is those industries are raising wages to try to get people back. You know, in terms of the overall issue of the tightness of the job market and what's happening with the labor force, we've had more people retire during this pandemic. We've also lost a lot of immigrants who are coming into this country. That began with the Trump administration, and the Biden administration has not really relaxed those rules. So those are two areas where we're just missing workers. And so you have these massive numbers of job openings, and you don't have the workers in the country to fill them right now.
Steve Leisman, you're the best. Thank you. Thank you for breaking it down for us in a way that's really easy to understand.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So if you've enjoyed the milder than normal winter so far, brace yourself because winter is coming. I'm sorry to crib from Game of Thrones, but it is bitter cold, right? You've got this fast-moving storm dumping snow across the Northeast overnight into the afternoon today. Major travel headaches. Here is the scene in Maryland. Drivers were trapped on the interstate because of some crashes there. Luckily, it was nothing like what we saw on Monday when I-95 was jammed up for 50 miles. Still, you had thousands of flights canceled. You had schools canceled today. And it's not just a problem on the East Coast. Out west, all the rain they've been getting means major flooding in Washington. 20 miles along the I-5 are closed because of an overflow from the Chehalis River. Next up is this really bitter cold that will stay with the northern part of the country through early next week. Some places like the upper Midwest can expect wind chills as cold as 40 below zero. Did you hear what the Kazakhstan's president has ordered his troops to do? It's pretty sobering. Kill without warning. That's as protests on the ground get more and more violent. Richard Engel has the latest on what's behind it all. Coming up right after the break. So we want to come back to a story we first told you about earlier in the week on those protests in Kazakhstan. They are getting really violent, with the country's president acknowledging that he is ordering forces to, quote, shoot to kill protesters with no warning. I want to show you what some of the aftermath of these protests look like this morning. You can see windows broken into on buildings and cars. Do you see that truck burnt in the street down there? Ugh. It's really quiet. It's really eerie. It's really bizarre. I say eerie because this is what it looked like on Wednesday. Same city, right? Thousands of people outside government buildings. You can see them milling around. There's smoke from fires. At one point, there's a car that was flipped over. The government says dozens of people are dead, including 18 security officers. Hundreds of people are hurt. And here's the country's president, who pleaded with foreign allies, including Russia, to send in troops to put down protesters that he's calling terrorists. Richard Engel is following these developments from London. Richard, this is scary stuff. You know, when you look at this, these protests were sparked by, I think in part, gas prices going up. But it really is the culmination of decades of frustration in Kazakhstan against the government.
These are the biggest protests that Kazakhstan has seen in the 3 decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Kazakhstan became an independent country. And Kazakhstan in Central Asia is a wealthy country. It has a tremendous amount of oil and gas, natural gas. It is a large country. Just if you look at the terrain, it is a massive country. And it has had entrenched autocratic rule. And these protests began on Sunday when the government relieved subsidies that were elevating fuel prices, liquefied natural gas that a lot of people use in their cars. And people went out to the streets after the gas prices nearly doubled. And what started out as a protest for a very specific grievance about the doubling or nearly doubling of gas prices quickly spread. It spread like wildfire. It took some of the protesters themselves by surprise. They didn't exactly know what the objective was, who was leading it. It was going to city. People were occupying government buildings. Some of them, they were burning government buildings down. Some of the elites started to leave the country. And that is when President Tokayev decided that he needed help, and he called in this Russian-led alliance of Central Asian states. It's sort of like a Russian version of NATO to come to his assistance. And thousands of Russian troops and other countries and troops from other neighboring countries have arrived. And then today you saw the president issue this very bold threat that the troops have been ordered his troops have been ordered to shoot to kill, and that they would not be warning shots, that they would fire without warning to try and intimidate people, to tell people to stay in their homes, don't dare to come out because they won't get a second shot.
Can you talk more about the Russia factor in this, Richard? We know, we know that the Kazakhstan president is asking for help with Russia, et cetera. That's led to a warning from the Secretary of State. Talk about Putin's role in this. Talk about where Moscow is here.
So if you have to look at the context here. So Russia, we've been talking about Russia a lot recently because Russia has tens of thousands of troops, roughly 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine. Now, some of those troops that are on the border with Ukraine had actually been taken away from the Kazakh border. So this upheaval in Kazakhstan has the potential to hurt Putin, and it also has the potential to help his interests. The potential to hurt him is if this becomes a long, drawn-out uprising that has enormous logistical challenges when you're talking about a country the size of Kazakhstan. That it means that the downside is that Putin could see his forces drawn into a long-term mission to support his beleaguered ally. But things in Almaty, the biggest city in Kazakhstan, are looking quieter, more frightened at this stage. The government claims to have restored order, claims to have retaken the airport, claims to have restored some internet services in some parts, while also issuing the threat that this is not in order to spread rumors and that it could be, those services could be quickly taken away again. But the government is expressing more confidence. And if this crisis is resolved quickly, then it has the potential to help Vladimir Putin, because he's sending troops into Kazakhstan, so he's solidifying his role in that country. He's presenting himself and this Russian sort of NATO-style alliance as the savior of Russia's allies in the region. And then he would be able to go into talks with the U.S. and Europe on Monday in a strong position, because he's acted decisively, he's put down an uprising, and now his forces are ready to focus on the other challenge of Ukraine. So it really depends on how long and complicated and drawn out the unrest in Kazakhstan turns out to be.
Richard Engel, thank you very much for that breakdown. It's such an important story. We're glad to have you here on it. Appreciate it. Coming up on the show, it looks like North Korea is blowing out the torch in the Beijing Winter Olympics. But wait a second, they were already banned from the games. So is this you're not dumping me, I'm dumping you? We'll explain. Plus, a COVID lockdown in a Chinese city that is so harsh, people are reportedly running low on food and medicine. Janice Mackey-Freyer is in Beijing next. All right, let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the 2 Michigan parents of the Oxford school shooting suspect were back in court earlier today to ask a judge for lower bail. James and Jennifer Crumbley's request denied. They've been in jail since December 4th on $500,000 bond. Their son, Ethan, waived a key hearing today, which means his case, that is going straight to a trial court. Number 2, the FBI is opening up an investigation into bomb threats received at least 8 historically black colleges this weekend. Howard University here in Washington, Spelman College in Atlanta, among the schools where threats were reported, no bombs were found. Number 3, remember the company Cyber Ninjas? They led that partisan review of Arizona's 2020 election. They are no more. They're shutting down after the company refused to release documents to an Arizona newspaper despite a judge's order and the threat of $50,000 a day in fines. Number 4, check out what GameStop's doing, getting in on NFTs. They're trying to create a marketplace just for NFTs and is close to sealing some cryptocurrency partnerships, too. The stock soared as much as 22% after that news came out. And number 5, Hollywood and a lot of people around the country are really grieving the loss of actor Sidney Poitier. He was the man behind such legendary and iconic performances in classics like In the Heat of the Night and Lilies of the Field. Poitier broke so many barriers. He was the first black man to win an Academy Award for Best Actor in 1964. He was 94 years old. A true legend. Elsewhere, North Korea says it's skipping the Winter Olympics in China, even though the country's already been banned from attending. Here's the deal. Back in September, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, suspended North Korea from next month's event after North Korea refused to send teams to the Summer Games in Tokyo because of COVID. But the committee left the door open for individual North Korean athletes to participate if they qualified. Well, today, North Korea made it clear. They say they're not going to be part of the Games because of, quote, hostile forces in the worldwide pandemic. The Games are scheduled to start February 4th. And speaking of that, February 4th, that is less than a month away. Guys, the Winter Olympics is in like 3.5 weeks. Can you believe that? But the question now seems to be, when it comes to the virus, will China's authoritarian leadership create a problem for the Olympics? In the city of Xi'an, a few hundred miles southwest of where the Olympics will be held in Beijing, you see the map right there? 13 million residents have been in lockdown since before Christmas, December 22nd. This is the country's longest lockdown since the whole Wuhan outbreak back in 2020. You remember that. Now, people apparently need basic necessities. They can't get them. There are more stories coming out of people stuck at home begging for help. Janice Mackey-Freyer is in Beijing. Janice, how bad is it?
From the early days, there were a lot of complaints online. People worried about ordering food. They just weren't able to get it. They were running low on supplies, because we have to understand what a Chinese-style lockdown means. Lockdown means you stay at home and you're not allowed to leave. You're not allowed to go for a walk or to get some fresh air. The only reason you're able to go outside is if you're going to go for mass testing or if you need medical help. And even accessing medical care is difficult, Hallie, and getting access to medications that are often life-saving. And there was a real outcry on social media with this terrible story in the past week of an 8-month pregnant woman who went to a hospital in Xi'an. She had her COVID test result, but there was a problem with it, so they wouldn't let her into the hospital. And she waited, and she waited, and she miscarried, and she lost the baby. There were several officials who were fired, so there was an acknowledgement by the government that something had gone terribly wrong. So the situation now is, from people we've talked to, is that people are now feeling like they're getting the food drops, that they have most of the supplies that they need. There are still concerns about running out, but people are taking it in stride because really there's nothing else they can do. I spoke with a young medical student at a university there, Arslan Hassan, and he said that they've been coming onto his campus and disinfecting every other day.
I myself have been tested more than 10 times. If there was no lockdown, there would have been more cases, maybe around 10,000 or more. But I think the lockdown was a better choice.
And there are no signs of the lockdown being lifted quite yet, Hallie.
It's incredible to listen to and incredible to hear, and even more incredible, Janice, when you think about, like, literally in 3.5 weeks, the Winter Olympics are starting in that country, in China. Managing that has got to be just difficult, right? How are they doing it? Are they ready? What are people there saying?
Well, anybody who's going to come into the country, athletes, officials, they're going to go immediately into this Olympic bubble, and things are going to be much more strict than they were in Tokyo. This will be very harshly enforced. People are going to be tested every day in the bubble. There's going to be limited movement between official sites on designated transportation, and there will be absolutely zero interaction with the outside world. Still, there is the expectation that there are going to be some COVID outbreaks even within that bubble, just given the sheer number of people who are going to be coming into the country from places where the Omicron variant is running rampant. The issue that China is going to face with the Olympics and in the weeks that follow is that the playbook that they're using now, this zero COVID strategy, is pretty much the same one that they've been using for most of the pandemic. It hasn't really adapted at all with the pandemic. So what we have now is a population in China that's been largely protected from the virus, but there's been little exposure to the virus. So I'm seeing and feeling much more fear now with a lot of people coming from around the world in for the Olympics. People are more concerned that the Omicron variant is going to take root here. China has been able to keep the number of cases here low with its zero COVID strategy, with quarantines and mass testing and that sort of thing. But there is also, that lack of exposure that also limits the experience that they have in treating outbreaks in any other way but with this zero COVID strategy.
I tell you, Janice, it is so valuable, and I so appreciate you coming on because you are there, right? You live in Beijing. This is where you live, and so to hear your perspective is just so important. So thank you very much for being with us, Janice. I appreciate it, as always.
Thanks, Hallie.
Coming up, we've got an update on that deadly Philadelphia fire a couple weeks ago. While officials are still looking into it, they think they've figured out a possible cause. We'll tell you what it is coming up in the local. Plus, we know college kids everywhere are feeling the pinch of student loans. Now, some of their parents are feeling the pressure, too. Zincle Esimwa explains in tonight's Original. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Northeast Bureau, an update on that deadly fire in Philadelphia earlier this week. Officials are looking into whether a little kid playing with a lighter near a Christmas tree may have started it, according to the search warrant. The district attorney's office tells NBC News this investigation is not a criminal one yet. Such a horrific situation there. Multiple kids dead in that fire, of course. Also from our Northeast Bureau, it's game on for mobile sports betting in New York starting tomorrow morning. That's when people can make online sports bets through 4 licensed operators. There's more apps in the process of getting vetted, but for now, supporters say, some of them, they're glad they'll be able to put some money on the Super Bowl before that happens. And from our West Coast Bureau, if you're in the market for a new home, boy, do we have a listing for you. Just a cool $295 million in LA. It's 105,000 square feet. That's like 100 of my houses, 300 of my houses. It's known as The One because it is the one most expensive listing in America. No, I don't know if that's why it's called The One, but holy cow, look at it. I mean, it's gorgeous, but that ain't cheap. Property heads to auction next month if it doesn't sell soon. But with that price tag, you think it would get snatched up. We want to bring you today's Original now with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. And listen, it's no secret, right? The price tag for college is bananas. And that means student debt is also bananas. It's a lot. Americans owed, get this, $1.75 trillion in student loan debt at the start of this school year. So average that out, right, to all 2020 grads, people who graduated in the last couple of years, it's about $29,000 per person. And that number just keeps going up and up and up. You've got students working really hard putting together different options to help pay for a degree. Maybe you've got a little work study here. You've got some private loans here, some federal loans here. But sometimes it's not enough. So if you're running out of options, you had some parents and guardians turning to what are called plus loans, hoping to provide a good education for their kid, only to get stuck financially down the road. Zincle Esimwa has more.
Your U.S. Department of Education student loan servicer.
How do you feel getting those messages?
Oh, it gives me anxiety, because I know I have to face paying this.
Patricia Rizzo took out 7 Parent Plus loans over 8 semesters to get her daughter, Emily Rizzo, through Skidmore College.
Would your daughter have been able to go to school without the Parent Plus loan?
No. This was the bulk of the tuition.
The Department of Education limits the amount of federal loans students qualify for per year, so families can turn to another federal option, Plus, also known as Direct Plus or Parent Plus loans. These allow parents or guardians to take out loans for their dependents. For Rizzo, her interest rates on Plus loans vary from 6 to 7%.
The scary part is how much interest it accrues over time. The principal is $100,000, but I accrued $26,000 in interest, and this is my balance right now, $126,167.
What started as a decision to improve her daughter's future has now impacted the possibilities for her own.
And what I'm looking at right now is paying it over 20 years, which will make me 82.
82? What about retirement?
I can't think about retiring.
Recent surveys find 26% of parents with Plus loan debt will not retire as initially planned. The Plus program, beginning in the 1980s, now facing a different U.S. economy. The average amount of student loan debt for borrowers over 60 roughly doubled from 2005 to 2015. And for borrowers over 60, most of that debt is for their children.
Traditionally, this loan was developed to help parents who were middle income be able to afford a 4-year education. Instead, we're seeing it be more and more lower income or middle income families get in over their heads on this debt.
These loans can cover up to the cost of attendance, so long as borrowers pass a credit check, meaning some parents are borrowing much more than they can afford. In Rizzo's case, she earns around $40,000 a year working at a drug rehab center in New Jersey. The 62-year-old plans to pay the loan off, but has not started making payments. As debt climbs, so too does public debate.
They would get relief.
Canceling student loan debt.
$50,000. Paying the student loan and paying the rent.
The Biden administration paused student loan payments until May 1st, 2022. For those struggling to pay these loans, there are options, including a federal direct consolidation loan, talking to loan servicers about interest, being mindful of refinancing in the private market, and knowing that declaring bankruptcy for student debt is hard. That's according to Fishman, not a financial expert, but an expert in education policy. She adds that if not paid, the government can come after Social Security, wages, tax refunds, and it can negatively impact credit.
We really need to focus on improving affordability for low and middle income families so that we aren't having to rely on intergenerational debt.
Do you regret taking on the Parent Plus loan?
I can't say I regret because my daughter has accomplished so much.
How did you feel when she crossed that stage?
She went above and beyond, and I was very proud of her.
Zincle is with us now, and it is so interesting and I think so relevant, Zincle, to anybody, who's been through college, had student loan debt, has current student loan debt. And we know that this program has had some criticism, but historically black colleges fought pretty hard to keep it going during the Obama years.
Yeah, Hallie, and it's such a complicated program, right? When the Obama administration tried to roll back the number of borrowers eligible for PLUS, they got instant pushback from HBCUs. There were presidents speaking out. There were op-eds written. At one point, there was even a threat of a lawsuit. They were saying it was impacting their enrollment and the ability of students to attend college. So I think to say the program has been the subject of critique is a big understatement, Hallie.
So fast forward to today, right? This program's gotten folded into the bigger debate about canceling student loan debt, et cetera. If President Biden, and there's no indication he's going to do this right now, right? But if he were to wipe out at least some student loan debt, how would Parent Plus loans be affected?
Yeah, so this is complicated, right? The short answer is we won't know until student loan forward legislation passes. That said, right now there are ways that student loan debt and Parent Plus debt can get canceled. That's through discharge, that's through forgiveness, or that's through cancellation. Discharge would happen if a parent who borrowed or the student passes, and cancellation often happens through work. So if you're a teacher in a public service program, but ultimately it's very clear that the level of debt that so many parents are holding is an issue that the government is going to have to address.
Zincle Ahmaud. Zincle, great to have you on with this. Thank you so much. Coming up here on the show, a transgender swimmer at the University of Pennsylvania is breaking a bunch of college records. But some people are saying Leah Thomas shouldn't be able to compete. The Ivy League is backing her up, but that may not be enough to put this controversy to bed. So-called controversy. We're going to get into it after the break. The world's top men's tennis player, Novak Djokovic, he's thanking fans from an immigration hotel in Australia because he's still not allowed to technically get into the country. Djokovic says on Instagram he's got people around the world giving him support. That's after the Australian government denied a visa for the 10-time Australian Open champion, saying his request for a medical exemption for the COVID vaccine is not good enough. But you know who Novak Djokovic, said that wrong. He's not getting sympathy from? Some of his fellow colleagues. His fellow superstar Rafael Nadal actually criticized Djokovic's stance to refuse to get the shot. Watch this.
He knew the conditions since a lot of months ago, so he makes his own decision.
Nadal also says he believes in the science behind the vaccine. The Australian Open is set to begin in 10 days with or without Djokovic. Speaking of athletes, here's another one who's a star, Leah Thompson. Last month, the swimmer at the University of Pennsylvania set 2 different Ivy League records. Her critics are furious, saying she shouldn't even be allowed to compete. That's because Leah Thomas is transgender and at the epicenter of this culture war, you could call it. Tomorrow is her final home meet of the season. She'll face off against Dartmouth and Yale. Both Penn Athletics and the Ivy League have put out statements supporting Leah. But of course, she is just the latest trans athlete to come under fire. In fact, 10 states have recently passed some kind of bill banning trans athletes from participating in youth sports. You might remember trans runner Cece Telfer was deemed ineligible to compete at the U.S. Olympic trials over the summer. So let's talk about it now with Joe Yerkeba from NBC Out, who just published this piece with the latest about Leah. Joe, I'm glad to have you here. Talk about what's going on here, right? Because Leah does have support from her team, from her school, from her league, if you will. And yet, for some of her detractors, that doesn't seem to be enough.
Sure, yeah. So there are a few different arguments happening here. You've got an argument about fairness. There are people who oppose trans women competing in women's sports because they say it's unfair to cisgender women who aren't trans, most of whom don't receive the athletic advantages of higher testosterone levels during puberty. Though then you have folks who say there's very little scientific evidence that shows that those advantages carry over for trans women after transition. So then you've got this argument about fairness and human rights on the other side. And trans advocates say that this question of inclusion is about more than just sports because, you know, we're still seeing these efforts at the state level to ban trans people from using the bathrooms of their gender. So they say this debate is really part of a larger conversation about whether trans people can participate in certain aspects of society at all.
Talk about how the NCAA is handling this.
Yeah, so the NCAA released a handbook with guidance for trans athletes back in 2011. And it says that trans women must complete 1 year of testosterone suppression treatment before they can compete on a women's team. And Leah had completed 2.5 years by the time she began competing. So the University of Pennsylvania pointed out that, you know, she's exceeded the NCAA protocols here.
You talked about this is a bigger issue sort of systemically in this country. And we said it earlier. There's 10 states that have laws that ban trans youth from participating in some of their sports. You know, this is an issue that I think I've covered in my course of reporting here at NBC News and talked to young trans athletes. I spoke with one just recently. It's troublesome, I think, for some of these families who have kids who want to compete and who are not being allowed to.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. And the legislation is really sweeping. So it applies to public K through 12 schools and colleges. And, you know, some even applies to private schools, too. And these are total bans, though their supporters would argue, you know, that they allow trans students to compete on the team of their birth sex. But, you know, like you mentioned trans student athletes, they say that that doesn't really make sense to them because for a trans girl, for example, she's a girl in her everyday life and everyone at school knows her as a girl. So this legislation is really troubling for them.
Joe Yerkeba, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for being with us. That's a wrap for this hour and for this week. Much more here for you Monday, same time, same place. Have a good weekend, gang. We got more coverage picking up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.